Hey everybody, welcome to Grad Student Book Reviews, where we take an academic work and we dissect its thesis and main arguments in less than 5 minutes. Alright, today's work is Russell Weigley's The American Way of War, which is a classic in military strategy and political thought. Alright, if you need the full citation, it's in the comments, so check that out. Alright, let's get to it. So, Weigley argues that there is a distinctly American way of war. It's based on a strategy of annihilation, using total war to demand the full and unconditional surrender of an enemy. Right, and he takes us all the way back to the American Revolution. This is where he starts his argument. He says, in the American Revolution, we really had no strategy, partially because at the start of it, we had no military. But nonetheless, we still wanted this full and total unconditional surrender of the enemy. We wanted the British gone out of our lands, right, which kind of derived out of the French and Indian War. He doesn't spend too much time on that, but he says that that's what we wanted from the French. We wanted them gone. Same thing with the British. We didn't get it necessarily after the American Revolution, but we did get it at the end of the War of 1812. All right, so Weigley continues his argument and continues this notion of a strategy of annihilation. Even though we are too small to fully implement it yet, he carries us all the way into the Civil War. And this is where things really change. This is kind of the crux of his argument. He says that the Civil War, specifically the end of it and Sherman's march to the sea and Grant's campaigning towards Richmond, solidified the strategy of annihilation. It showed the effectiveness of the full and complete destruction of enemy forces. Right? So that kind of took over in our thought. As you carry that same line of thinking forward, Weigley argues that the Army uses Grant's strategy of annihilation. The Navy uses a Mahanian strategy of decisive battle and the complete destruction of an enemy's navy. And even the Air Force took Duhay's theory of air power, of strategic bombing from the turn of the century, and continues to use that. Right? So all three of these main strategies are the strategy of annihilation, looking for the full and total destruction of enemy forces. Okay? Now, Weigley also takes this into the atomic age, and this changes things a little bit. We still are looking for a strategy of annihilation, right? This is where massive retaliation comes from. We will destroy a country that attacks us with nuclear weapons. But it's also where deterrence comes from, okay? As Americans, we've adopted this strategy of deterrence. We will not go to war unless provoked, but once we go to war, it will be total war, right? We will throw everything we have into it, okay? Now, Weigley does go into Korea and Vietnam a little bit. He talked a little bit about this. He says this was a tough spot for us because they were limited wars. They were initially limited wars, but we don't really know how to fight a limited war. We fight total wars using strategy of annihilation. If we can't do that, we struggle with it. So that's kind of where he sees the problem with Korea and Vietnam. He does kind of allude to some of the same teachings as Henry Kissinger or Bernard Brodie, maybe Maxwell Taylor, who talks about the problems with massive retaliation. But nonetheless, Weigley's work is a success here. Okay, he does outline, and he proves this fairly conclusively, how Americans have always wanted this strategy of annihilation. We've wanted total warfare when we go to war. Not that we want war, but when we do want war, we go big or go home. Right? And I think in that vein, his argument is successful. He does a great job of going through each strategic thinker, each major strategic thinker, and showing how that works. Okay? So, this is a important work, especially for the military historian. Okay? If you are taking comps or taking a military history class, if you're majoring in military history, you got to read this work. Okay? Historians have argued with and for him and against him on both sides. Okay, John Grenier's The First Way of War argues that there is an American way of war, but it started much, much earlier. Okay, other historians have taken Weigley's work and continued it past the 70s when he wrote this, or at least when my copy is published, and they take it through the end of the Cold War and into the Gulf Wars. Okay, saying that there is an American way of war. All right, so nonetheless, if you're a historian, an American historian, a military historian, you got to read this one. It's huge. If you agree with me, put it down in the comments. If you disagree with me, put it in the comments. Subscribe, and we can continue this discourse later. Keep studying.